property is collective property. Collective property allows the community as a whole to collectively decide how the property will be used. So when you hear of a collective, it means that decision making on how to allocate the resources amongst the group is shared by the members of the collective. They decide how property is allocated. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that, as with common property, that everybody's going to have equal access or equal use to the land, but it does mean that everyone will get a say in who gets what and how it's used. Plato argued that collective ownership was what was best for society, and that through collective ownership, society could promote the common interests and avoid the divisiveness of private property. Private property is another alternative to collective and common property. Private property laws allocate particular things to particular individuals, and those individuals can use those things as however they please. They can exclude others, and there are minimal societal restrictions on use. So the primary elements of private property really have to do with the degree of control, the ability to exclude, and that there are few limits on the use of the property. Law that governs private property are used to enforce the right to determine how the property is used and the right to exclude others, amongst other bundles of rights. The laws of most Western countries favor the creation of private property. So next we're going to explore why. So why private property in the West? The justification for private property rights in the West are based on the writings of many classical philosophers, perhaps most notably John Locke. But before we get into Locke's labor theory of property, we need to talk about one theory that came before Locke's theory of property, and that is the theory of first occupancy. Now, your book refers to it as the theory of first possession, or the first possession approach, but it's also referred to in the literature as the theory of first occupancy. The first occupancy theory, or first possession theory, was most notably articulated by a philosopher by the name of Samuel Pufendorf. He articulated this theory by saying that the first person to use property should be given private ownership of that property because they weren't taking that property away from anyone else. It's a very simple rule. If a property is not being possessed by someone, then it's fair game. The first person that possesses the property should receive ownership. Now, while this is an easy rule or law to enforce, first come, first serve, it has some moral implications. And so John Locke built on this concept. He agreed with Pufendorf that first occupiers should not dispossess anyone else, and because they didn't dispossess anyone else, then they could have possession of a property. But Locke felt that the possession of property in and of itself could cause societal harm because it decreases the property that others can own, and it decreases property available to others. So, using the first occupancy theory did not really justify private property in Locke's view, because it didn't address why private property regimes were in the best interest of the public. So sure, it didn't hurt anybody because it didn't dispossess anybody of property that they owned, but it also did not improve society. So Locke thought to build on this concept by adding justification for why private property ownership benefited society. He argued that a person needed to not only be the first person to occupy land, but he added one requirement, which is that a person also needs to use the land productively. So he added productive use to the requirements for property possession. And Locke reasoned that productive use of land was a value to society. So it was a value to society because it increased the amount of goods that were available for society. And because there were these increased goods, society would benefit by becoming wealthier on the whole. Markets would be created where people could then exchange goods, and society would be better off. Now, as we know, the risk of such private markets is that wealth in these markets is often distributed unequally. And this particularly because in the Western form of private property ownership, it allows for inheritance, which means that private property passes from generation to generation and can increase a divide in wealth, with some portions of the population accumulating large amounts of wealth over time and others accumulating much less wealth. Well, aside from Locke justifying private property by arguing that it was for the benefit of society because productive use of land increased the amount of goods, Locke also justified ownership because he reasoned that a person mixed his own labor with that of the land. And because there was this mixture of labor and land, or labor and other property, it justified his ownership. In other words, the person worked for it, so they deserved to call it their own. Now, your textbook calls this Lockean theory of property the labor theory. So just know that it is referencing what I'm talking about as the Lockean theory of property. So while Locke is often cited and as being heavily influential for early legal theory in the U.S., there are other philosophical justifications for private property ownership that have become popular, particularly in modern history, and they've been used by courts to justify upholding certain property laws. One of these theories is utilitarianism. Now, your book begins with Jeremy Bentham's version of utilitarianism, but I think it's important to get a little bit more background on utilitarianism. So the next video will give you a brief overview of utilitarian theory. Now, it is not specific to private property. Your job will be to apply the theories to what you've learned about private property so far. How does utilitarian theory justify the private ownership of property? So take notes, because you